we look at talent funnel, we look at interview funnel, for example, because every interview has, for example, 5 different rounds, right? You can look at where minorities or women start to drop in different stages of the application. And if you realize, oh, they're not really passing resume screening, why is that?
Hi there, welcome to my channel. My name is Rachel. In today's episode, I'm going to interview my good friend, Jackie. She currently works as a diversity and inclusion lead at a Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company. In her years of experience in organizational behaviors at consulting company and hedge fund, and now at a pharmaceutical company, she has learned a ton in leadership development, organizational behaviors. And as a minority, how can you increase your visibility and voice in corporate America? If you like this episode, please like, subscribe to my channel, and leave your comments, suggestions, and questions in the comment section. So hi, Jackie.
Hi, Rachel. How's it going?
Been a long time since I talked to you.
I know. And now you're married. Congratulations.
Thanks. Conversation. It's going to be a different YouTube video all about.
Can't wait for that episode.
Today's episode is all about you.
Okay. Sounds good.
Your insights to share with the audience here. And I think, why don't we start off by introducing yourself? Beforehand, I forgot to mention that we actually met through a mutual friend, and we first saw each other at a temple in Bronx.
Yeah, that was kind of random.
We're both interested in organizational psychology. I ended up going into marketing, but you actually work in a field. So you can do a better job than me in explaining what the field is like. So
I'll try.
I'd love to hear more about yourself. How did you decide to study in this program, and how did you get into the organizational psychology field?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit about me. I studied psychology undergrad. I went to a small liberal arts college, and psychology, I just felt like I found my calling in psychology after I took Psychology 101 course. I just fell in love with it. And during my junior year, I studied abroad in Denmark. And that was my first time getting exposure to organizational psychology. So if for the audience who's not familiar with this field, you can essentially think of it as psychology at the workplace. And during my time in Denmark, I attended a workshop called Happiness at Work. And it was really, really eye-opening for me because I never really associated happiness with work previously, right? Because I heard about people complaining about their job, complaining about their managers. And to me, work has always been perceived as this like very miserable thing that you just do as a part of life. And as I was learning about happiness at work, I was like, that makes so much more sense because life is so short. Why are we spending so much time, hating our job, like hating our life? And if we have a negative experience at work, we're very likely going to carry that negative emotion into our personal life, right? That's going to affect our friendship, our relation with our family, etc. So I made it sort of my life mission to transform people's experience at the workplace, try to create not like solve everything, but at least make it a little bit more tolerable, if you will, for people at work. So that's sort of like how I got into this field, and I'm really enjoying it so far.
Got it. So I saw that you study psychology, general psychology for undergrad, but then you went on to Columbia to get your master's in organizational psychology. Yep. So for people, those of you guys who don't know anything about organizational psychology, can you explain what organizational psychology is all about?
Yeah, it's very, very broad. Psychology as an umbrella term is very broad. And when people think of psychology, they often think of therapist, right? But under psychology, there's cognitive psychology, there's adolescent psychology, there's there's just so many more like subfields within psychology. And organizational psychology, compared to the other subfields, is relatively new. And most often it falls under human resources at most companies. So it's really about like understanding how to, for example, motivate employees, how to increase employee productivity, how to develop and train better managers, how to drive employee engagement. Because we know that when employees are more engaged, they're going to be more productive, and the company is going to be more profitable, right? And there's also a saying like happy employee, happy customer, right? So you want to make sure your employee is as quote unquote happy as possible, so they can like show more like drive in their work, and hopefully that will also create a ripple effect to impact the customers as well.
Got it. So now I get a pretty good understanding of your job conceptually. But when it comes to day to day and some of the typical moments of your work streams, can you describe what your job entails?
Yeah, sure. So
The day of an organizational psychologist.
it's a little bit hard to explain because every day is different and my work is more project based, right? So I can tell you a little bit more about what my sort of general career has been like. So for example, there was one project I did that there was a part of the organization that's experiencing very high turnover rate, right? So we conducted like focus groups to understand why there's such high turnover rate. Like, was it because of the workload? Was it because of the manager? Like, what were the root causes of this problem? Because as you can imagine, turnover is extremely costly for the organization, right? Like it took them a long time to hire this employee and to train this employee, and it's going to cost a lot of money to hire a new person, right? The similar as in marketing, it's so much more expensive to recruit a new customer than retaining a current customer, right? It's a similar concept. And especially if you're gonna retain like a recruiting agency to help you find talent, that's even more expensive. So a lot of companies really want to minimize attrition, both from a cost perspective, but also from like consistency standpoint, right? They want to make sure, for example, if you're interacting with customer day to day, they want to make sure the customer has a consistent experience, not seeing like a new face every single time they speak, with the company. So like we conduct focus groups, and based on the focus group, we identified there was high turnover due to employee burnout. And then we created an action plan, which is more the effort is called predictable time off. So a lot of people were complaining about how they could never have a personal life because they would be called into the office like 6 p.m. at night, or they would be asked to do work on the weekend. So they could never even plan like family vacation, for example. So we implemented this program for employees to have designated time to unplug, right? So like it's like small things like that to help change employees' life a little bit. And also I used to do a lot of leadership development program. So what that means is we look at the needs of the managers, like what is one particular area they definitely need. So for example, I once had a client who was going to double its size over the next 5 years. And the company knew that leading a company of the current size and leading a company of double the size is going to be very, very different. So they hired my team to help basically create a leadership development program to train the managers, to equip them to lead the future of the organization. So it's more like proactive approach versus reactive. So that's like just two small examples to kind of give you flavor of what org psychology is.
And what type of hard skills or soft skills do organizational psychologists need to have to succeed in the job?
Hard skill, not so much. I would say PowerPoint. I live and breathe PowerPoint. So every day I create a lot of PowerPoint decks. And in terms of soft skill, I guess communication, ability to influence, maybe like empathy, right? Really trying to put yourself in the client's shoes or in the employee's shoes. And also really like push through, because what makes our organizational psychology difficult is it's so like it can be perceived as very fluffy, right? Because it's not measurable. It's not really, a lot of it's indirect impact, right? Like it's not so straightforward as like marketing. It has a direct impact on bottom line, right? Like what I do is very much like an indirect line into the company's bottom line. So oftentimes leaders overlook this area. So it's really about like getting buy-in, helping stakeholders understand why we're investing in this, because otherwise it's going to be really, really difficult to move things ahead. Because like why, which is also why for people do what I do, we often find it difficult because only very large companies have teams like us, because we're often the second sort of like thought, if you will, right? Because when companies that are small, they're struggling to survive. Like they're not gonna care so much about employee psychology. It's only when they're a little bit more mature, they have the capacity and the resources to invest in teams like us.
That is so,
Yeah.
yeah. And kind of want to transition the topic a little bit from organizational psychology to your current position and your job as a diversity and inclusion lead, which is also a top topic nowadays. A lot of companies are expanding their diversity and inclusion team or hire someone to start that function, especially for companies that historically lack diversity or have a bad track record in that field. Can you tell us how you get into diversity and inclusion, what pushed you into that direction, whether it's proactively or reactively? Tell us a little bit more about your experience in diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, sure. So diversity and inclusion has always been something that's very near and dear to my heart, right? Being an international student and someone who has lived in 4 different countries and experienced very, very different, like many, many different cultures, and being a foreigner in this country, like this topic has always been like very, again, very near to my heart. So I've always had a very strong passion for it, but I've always sort of like done it on the side, not really like as a full-time job. And last year, I had the opportunity to take on a role at a global Fortune 500 company to do D&I work, diversity inclusion work. And it was like, it took me a while to decide whether this was the right path for me, to be honest. This may sound really silly, but I firmly believe that if you love something, don't make it for your full-time job, because then it's going to kill the passion. So I was like, okay, do I really want to do this? And also D&I is very, very niche, right? It's a very, very niche area. And it only became sort of like popular and become hot because of what happened last year. And you don't know how long it's going to last. And I don't want to be pigeonholed once I ever leave this company. Am I going to be able to find my next job, right? So those were some of my top concerns. But I was at a point, I'm like, hey, you know what? Let me just like try it for a year or two and see how it goes. So that's sort of like what led me to this field. And I would say, let me start with the good, right? The good is there's just like so much momentum around D&I right now. Every company's talking about it. It's on, every CEO's agenda. So that part is great. But on the other hand, I think a lot of companies are still very, very behind in their thinking of D&I, right? Especially when it comes to like the definition of diversity, right? What does diversity mean? Currently, most companies are still mostly looking at gender and ethnicity, but there's so many more diversity dimensions to it, right? Like, I don't just see myself as, like Asian female. Like I'm made up with so many more experiences, so many life experiences I previously had, right? So that part is a little bit frustrating. And also, I would say a lot of people still don't understand why we need to focus on D&I. Some people are like, oh, it's a nice thing to have. It's almost like
the goods, but I feel like you transitioned to the bads right away.
The good is very limited, I would say. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, there are also other good things, right? Like, I truly feel like I'm making an impact, I'm making a difference in people's lives. And we get like I would get notes from employees and saying like, hey, this is why I chose to stay with this company. It's because of the programs that you guys offer, right? Mm-hmm. That makes me really, really happy. But I have to say it's a really, really difficult field to be in because it's so subjective. Mm-hmm. And it's so sensitive. Everyone has a view, right? Some things that may, I don't. I'm trying to find the diplomatic way to say this. Something that something one person may find offensive may not be offensive to others, right?
We kind of further define what diversity entail. Would that be a better way to kind of address this topic? Because you mentioned that it's not just about gender and ethnicity. There's much more beyond that. I also thought that diversity and inclusion should also include things like sexual orientation or that is other dimensions. So what exactly does diversity and inclusion include?
Yeah. I would say it really varies by company philosophy based on company philosophy. And I can break it down into two, right? So let's focus on, we can talk about diversity first, then we can talk about inclusion. So when I talk about diversity, like you just mentioned, there are so many different dimensions, right? Gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, veteran status, disability, even personality, right? Or now it's a very hot area is like neurodiversity, like autism spectrum, for example, right?
Diversity.
Neurodiversity, yeah. So there are so many different dimensions, and what's really tricky is some are really difficult to measure, and also a lot of information is highly sensitive, so you can really ask people to report it either. US compared to many other countries is actually really loose when it comes to data privacy. Like my company is a global company, like US is the only country that we can actually ask for almost as many dimensions we want. All the other countries, especially countries like Sweden, like you can barely even ask anything, right? So that makes it really difficult to even like measure and report, right? If you can measure it, you can really do something about it, if that makes sense, because you don't know what the gaps are, right? But I would say in the US currently, the focus is mostly still around gender and ethnicity. My company tried to expand it to sexual orientation, but again, it's very difficult because you couldn't really ask people to report. It's not a part of the reporting in the application process, right? You can only ask people to self-disclose. And many people still don't feel comfortable doing that, which I don't blame them. Yeah, so right now it's still limited to physical, I would say, like physical diversity.
Yeah. So I got this question from one of my friends. Once I told people that I'm going to interview you, everyone's very interested in learning more about this field. One common question that people have is, does diversity and inclusion have hard targets for the company to hit, especially for people in your function department? Do you guys have to come up with like a quota, and in order to fulfill certain kind of pools of candidates, is that coming at the expense of other candidates who are not in the diversity and inclusion bucket? How does it really work?
Yeah, I would.
It's a pretty sharp question, I know.
No, it's a good question. And I think it's a great question to help demystify, I think, some of the misconceptions we have. And I mean, at least at my current company or the companies I've been at, I'm not aware of any hard quota. What we call is ambition, right? We may have like a 2025 ambition. So for example, my company publicly discloses or publicly claims, is that the right word? Says that we are going to reach gender parity by 2025, right? And that's more like an ambition, like a goal. But are we going to really hire a female candidate over a male candidate simply for the gender? No, that's not going to be the case, right? At the end of the day, it's still going to be who's the most qualified. And I wouldn't say that, like, I think a lot of people are like, oh, because of, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, or because of, the recent recent news article, the social unrest, like companies are just like grabbing all the minorities on the street. Right? That's not really true either. And I personally get kind of disappointed and annoyed when companies have headlines like, oh, XYZ company appointed their first like female CEO or appointed their first Black CTO, something like that. Like I don't really like those kind of headlines, because I think that draws attention more to the demographics versus that person's credential, right? I'd rather you say, oh, appointed someone with like 20 years track record of XYZ, right? I think that's much better. And I think when companies have taglines about people's gender, race, ethnicity, or whatever those diversity dimensions are, like it kind of discredits that person in a way, right? And the people be, oh, so and so got hired because they're Black, or because they are, because they're gay, right? And that's not the intention. And I literally had a client who told me that the manager said something like that. Said that, oh, we're very happy that the manager said the next person we hire has to be Black.
They just
and that really rubbed people the wrong way. And also imagine what would happen if the next person hired is truly Black. Then no matter how great that person's background is, everyone's gonna think, okay, you got hired because of your ethnicity, not because of your capability, right? And that's just really unfortunate. And I've heard of only one company that actually promoted a lot of minorities after Black Lives Matter movement. They just like promoted just to make the sort of like the stats look a little bit better. And what they realized was, because they just promoted people without them being ready, they actually did not set them up for success. And they actually had to demote or even let go many of them after 6 months, after 1 year. And that actually makes the situation even worse, right? So that kind of connects to the inclusion part. Like bring people into the door. That's not the end of it, right? If you don't have the inclusion piece, the diversity part will just be a revolving door, right? So inclusion goes into, how do you set people up for success? How do you make sure they feel part of a community? How do you help them get promoted? All things like that.
Your title is actually Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Lead. So it's not just about attracting the talent, but also diversifying the talent pool, but also retaining and grooming those talent. I participated in the D&I committees at both my former company and my current company. Got a taste of what it's like to be part of that committee and community. But I think different companies do it differently. In our case, we have something called AAPI community. So every other week we meet up to discuss anything we can do to broaden awareness of the Asian American and Pacific Islanders culture through some company hosted event or speaker series. But I know different companies do it differently. So I would like to hear more about your focus outside of beyond just diversity aspect.
Yeah, I mean, definitely what you were referring to was what we call like employee resource group, right? That is that's a very common practice at companies to help drive inclusion. But we also do a lot of education, right? How do we train managers to be inclusive? Because every employee's day-to-day experience is mostly impacted by their manager, right? If their manager is not inclusive, they're not going to feel part of the company, and then they're going to have a sense of belonging. So how do we train manager? And oftentimes managers have the best intention, but they may not realize the impact of some of the behaviors they have, right? So it's really about driving awareness. Like it could be really, really small things, like make sure you don't schedule, happy hour Friday night, like, because like people with kids may not be able to attend, right? Or people with family obligations may not be able to attend. Like small things like that. And also like help them understand what unconscious biases are. And very, very importantly, we try to embed a D&I lens into everything we do in human resources and business, right? Because historically, D&I has always been seen as an HR topic, right? But it's really not. It's really a shared responsibility by every single employee and leader at the organization. And I can start with the HRP. So that is making sure, first of all, like you have an objective talent acquisition process, right? Like we look at talent funnel, we look at interview funnel, for example, because every interview has, for example, 5 different rounds, right? You can look at where minorities or women start to drop in different stages of the application. And if you realize, they're not really passing resume screening, why is that? Or they all seem to drop at stage 4. Why is that, right? Is it the question that we're asking? Is it the process that's a little bit more biased, so we can fix it? And once they come into the door, like, are we providing proper training for everyone? Are we giving everyone equal opportunity to develop, right? And there was one thing I was gonna mention. And also like you want to make sure people feel empowered, and they need to see people that look like them as well, right? Because if I look up and everyone's like, white male, am I going to be motivated to stay? Maybe not, right? So that's very important.
Sorry, due to limited time, we're not able to cover everything in this episode. So I'm going to leave the rest of the content to the next episode. If you are interested in hearing more, please subscribe to my channel, leave your comments and suggestions in the comment section below, and stay tuned. We'll see you next time. Bye.